Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm continuing my series of Mash retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 20, The Novocaine Mutiny. So, in this episode, it's a preliminary court-martial hearing, basically a fact-finding meeting to determine did Hawkeye commit mutiny against Frank when Colonel Potter was away. So, it's basically a courtroom drama. Now, I don't know how military court-martials exactly go. The Mash Wiki does give some advice about what was in the manual from 59, but this was not during 59. And so, if anyone has better knowledge on this stuff, let me know. I would love to see a legal expert especially one in military law, actually react to this episode and give their thoughts. Now, as long as they remember the historical context, because I saw a medical professional react to a MASH episode and forgot about the historical context. But that's a different matter. It really is a different matter, because what this episode really is showing how bad of a person Frank is. Literally, when Frank is doing his first witness stand opening remarks thing, he literally says that he basically says that basically, unless we all conform, unless we all follow our leaders blindly, we'll never be free. Frank, that's called authoritarianism, and you're not free under it. Yeah. Frank tries to claim Hawkeye is un-American, but he ends up revealing how much of an authoritarian he is, somebody who would end up following a strongman for no other reason than says to follow him, I guess. Frank's not a good person, and we know that. But this episode, beyond that, also shows how he's not fitted for command. He lets power go to his head. Literally, Colonel Potter, before he leaves, tells Frank, don't go over the top with discipline. I'm only going to be gone for 6 days. What's one of the first things Frank does when they're gone? Outlaws, or bans, I should say, gambling, which is what a lot of the camp does to pass time. Zero loses $300 gambling. Axon tells Frank that he lost 300, but so he doesn't get in trouble for gambling, he says he just lost it. It's gone. 1 minute's wallet, next minute, poof, gone. Frank then assumes the money has been stolen and goes on a hunt. BJ and Hawkeye tell Frank it was lost gambling. And you know what Frank does? He doesn't get mad because of gambling. He's like, no, I banned gambling, therefore can I have been lost gambling. Frank, they literally told you the truth and you don't believe it because you don't believe that people would go against your orders. You always think Hawkeye's out to get you and always... Yeah. Really shows Frank's character. And then turns out Radar knew where the money was the entire time because he had won it gambling and he had put in his teddy bear. And then Frank, in the court-martial room, basically says that he should have ripped the stuffing out of him. Radar, not Radar's teddy bear. I think Frank should be charged with conduct unbecoming an officer. I'm just saying. And then, of course, we hear Frank's own recap of the mutiny. Basically, he's portraying himself being the only competent person, everyone's failing, blah, blah, blah. And then he's stabbed with something by Hawkeye. Then Hawkeye goes to the stand and gives his version of events, which starts off saying that Frank's story is fascinating but untrue, but no doubt Frank remembers it that way. Which is actually probably the case, given how we know Frank likes to think of himself very highly, of course. And then Hawkeye's narrative is that Frank is doing a bad job at pre-op, and during their argument, so Hawkeye does admit that him and Frank did argue. Frank walked into the door and was knocked unconscious, which honestly is probably what really happened. And also, the coroner who's basically conducting this hearing says that he not just served testimony as boss of the records, and I wouldn't be surprised if written statements from the other people who was there, because the Coleman, the nurses who was there, all should have been put on the stand as well. For time reasons, why I can see why they didn't, but they should have been, and hopefully at least their written statements were taken, especially since this story is presented as a preliminary hearing. And then, of course, we get to hear that Hawkeye has a good record, and so they decide to trust him over Frank's record, where in the coroner's judgment, Frank would have been a pastry chef if he wasn't a doctor. So yeah, that tells you something. That's essentially where the episode ends. Hawkeye is gotten off once again because of mostly his medical skills, but also because his story is the truthful story as the narrative presents it. And then we get to see a ending scene where it's another gambling game. Frank complains to Colonel Potter. Colonel Potter's like, deal me in. Because Frank apparently had never rescinded his ban. You know, everyone assumed the minute Colonel Potter got back, the ban was lifted. Colonel Potter's gambled with them before. Of course he's going to lift it. And Colonel Potter, unlike Frank, does not let his authority get to his head. Yes, he knows when to use it, but he also knows when it's okay to let people break loose a little bit, especially if it's for morale purposes. So yeah, overall, it's a good, fun episode. It really shows how terrible of a person that Frank is. Not like we need to know that, but it's also just a fun episode. There's some just good, humorous moments. Though there is one moment where when Frank was searching, he goes into Corporal Klinger's tent, and he, goes through Klinger's, underwear, but he doesn't go through Father McKay's Carlos, which Radar calls him out on. And there's probably some other small moments I can't talk about, but there's one other moment I do want to share before I finish my review. And that's with Frank being, almost to regulation. There's one thing he does correct. Rightfully point out uncleanliness in the kitchen. I will give Frank credit for that. You do not want an unclean kitchen because that can cause food poisoning. That can cause illness. So he is right in that regard. Well, that's one place where, yeah, discipline should not be slacking. But letting people gamble, yeah, he should allow that. And some other things as well. But ultimately, that's the one thing I'll give Frank credit for, because food safety is not something you should take lightly. But there's another interesting part of this episode. Margaret does not appear at all. Because if she had appeared, that could have been a really interesting character dynamic where her sense of professional responsibility is in conflict with her, basically, loyalty, for lack of better term, her friendship, her romantic interest with Frank. It could have been a very interesting character conflict to see. Now, it sounds like there was scheduling conflicts that prevented Margaret from appearing because Loretta Swit was not able to appear for several of these final production episodes. And also, at least in universe, you can argue for that the hearing itself was someone who was responsible had to stay behind at the camp. And who would that be? Margaret. Actually, I made this comment on the Mash Reddit subreddit recently, where I forget everything about it, but essentially I made that, yeah, we all know Margaret is the one who should really be the second in command because she actually knows what she's doing. Something along those lines. But ultimately, though, despite her not being there, and it would have been good, I think, to have her in here, the episode did not suffer because of it. It's not like they had to... It's clear they wrote this episode knowing she was not going to be able to be there. Therefore, she doesn't feel missing from this episode. Her presence, I think, would have been nice, but it's not like they had to rewrite her role for another character and it suffers. So I'll give them credit on that. There was... Her not being there did not hurt the episode, which does sometimes happen when you remove a key character from a show. It can happen. This case it doesn't, and I'm going to give that as a credit to the writers who figured out how to write this episode without her and decided to have a different source of drama than a character conflict from Margaret rather than interpersonal conflict between Hawkeye and Frank, which I think in the context of this episode was definitely the right thing to do. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like and share. Also, consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all my latest content. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day, a good night, wherever you are. May the force be with you, always.